Lonely rancher bought a blind girl sold by her drunk father, then realized she saw. The sun was falling slowly behind the hills when Elias Ward rode into Briar Creek. Dust trailed behind his wagon like a ghost that refused to leave him alone. The town looked the same as always, wooden fronts leaning tiredly against the wind, horses tied outside the saloon, laughter from men who drank to forget their own names. Elias wasn't a man who came to town much. He liked the quiet of his ranch, the company of his horse, and the stillness that came after a long day of work. But that evening, something drew him toward Murphy's trading post, a sound, a crowd, a kind of wrongness that made his jaw tighten. At the edge of that crowd, an old man stood shouting on a wooden crate. His clothes were torn, his eyes wild with drink. Beside him, barely standing in the dust, was a young girl. Her hair was tangled, the color of pale wheat. Her eyes were cloudy, unfocused. She faced the sky like she was listening to something no one else could hear. The crowd murmured, half curious, half cruel. The old man yelled about how she was no good, couldn't see, couldn't earn, and how $10 would buy her freedom from his hands. Elias didn't plan to stop, but he did. He stepped forward, slow and steady, the way a man does when he's already decided before he understands it. The people turned to watch him. He was taller than most, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and silent. Nobody in Briar Creek ever called Elias a fool, but they called him lonely, and maybe that was worse. He handed the old man the money, took the girl by the arm, and led her away. No one spoke a word as they walked out of town. The road home was quiet except for the wheels creaking and the wind whispering over dry grass. The girl sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, her face calm but far away. When she spoke, her voice was soft as the wind through the pines. She said her name was Lila. Elias told her his name, though he doubted she'd care to remember it. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't flinch when the wagon hit the rough patches of road. It was like she'd been through worse than any bump could offer. By the time they reached his land, the moon had risen, bright and round, spilling light across the valley. The house stood at the edge of a fenced field, its boards gray and weary from years of storms. Elias helped Lila down, guided her toward the steps, and opened the door. Inside was a small fire still glowing from the evening meal. He showed her to a room with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single lantern on the table. She thanked him quietly, said she didn't mean to be any trouble. He told her no one was in trouble who worked honestly and ate little. Then he left her there and went out to the porch. He sat a long time, staring at the stars. The night was cool, and the wind carried the faint sound of her moving inside, slow steps, careful ones. He wondered what kind of father sold his daughter like a sack of feed. He wondered what kind of man he was for buying her. When he went to bed, sleep didn't come easy. He dreamed of eyes that saw through blindness, of hands reaching for something invisible. Morning came soft and golden. Elias woke early, as always, but the house already smelled of biscuits. He found Lila in the kitchen, her hair brushed, her hands steady as she turned the dough in the pan. She moved with a grace that didn't make sense for someone who couldn't see. She knew where the utensils were, knew how to avoid the edge of the counter, never once reaching blindly. Elias stood there for a moment, quiet, watching. She turned her head toward him, those pale eyes catching the morning light. She smiled faintly, like she knew he was there long before he made a sound. Days turned into weeks. She worked the ranch like she'd been born to it. She fed the hens, swept the porch, and even tended the garden out back. Elias tried to believe she was just careful, that maybe she'd memorized the layout by sound or touch. But sometimes, when he'd watch from a distance, he saw her pause to look at the sky, as if tracking clouds she wasn't supposed to see. He never said a word about it. One evening, he came in from the stables and found her sitting by the window, a piece of charcoal in her hand. She was sketching shaky lines on paper, forming something that looked like the outline of a man. He stepped closer, heart thudding slow and heavy. The face on the page was his. Rough beard, hat tilted, eyes shadowed just right. He didn't say a thing, just stood there in the dim light, feeling the world tilt a little. Lila set the paper down gently, her fingers smudged with black dust. She didn't turn to him, but she whispered something he almost didn't catch. "Sometimes," she said, "people see without their eyes." That night, the wind rose over the hills, carrying the smell of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Elias lay awake, listening to it, thinking about the girl in the next room, the one who drew his face and called herself blind. He didn't know it yet, but her secret would change everything he thought he knew about pain, about love, about seeing what mattered most. The storm broke before dawn, thunder rolling over the valley like the growl of an angry beast. Elias woke to the sound of rain hammering the roof, and, for a moment, he thought of the girl in the next room. He swung his legs off the bed, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the hallway. The door to her room was open just a crack. Inside, she was awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, her pale eyes turned toward the window. The lantern beside her flickered low, and in that trembling light, her face looked peaceful in a way that didn't fit the world she'd come from. He stepped away quietly, not wanting to startle her, and went to check the barn. The rain was cold and heavy, soaking through his shirt before he reached the door. The horses were restless, hooves thudding against the wood. He calmed them, whispered to them like old friends, and fixed a broken latch that banged loose in the wind. When he came back to the house, she was there waiting, standing by the fire with a towel in her hands. She told him he was dripping everywhere, her tone soft but sure. Elias froze. She couldn't have known that unless she'd seen him. He said nothing, just took the towel, dried off, and sat down near the fire. Lila poured him coffee, moving around the room like she'd been there her whole life. Her steps were light, her balance perfect, her gaze always a little too exact for someone lost in darkness. As the storm dragged through the day, they talked for the first time about things that weren't chores or meals. Elias told her about his ranch, how his father built it from nothing, how the winters here could cut through bone, and how silence was both his comfort and his curse. Lila listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She told him she'd been blind since she was 9. A fever, she said. Took her mother, took her sight, left her with a man who drank more than he spoke. Elias wanted to ask more, but something in her voice stopped him. That night, the storm passed, leaving the air clean and cold. The sky stretched wide and endless, stars sharp as needles. Elias stood outside for a long time, staring at the horizon. Behind him, the door creaked open. He turned and saw her step out barefoot, the hem of her dress brushing the porch boards. She tilted her head back toward the sky, breathing in deep like she could see every constellation. He asked what she was doing. She said she could feel the stars. Elias didn't understand, but the way she stood there, bathed in silver light, made him believe her anyway. The next days were quieter. Something had shifted between them, something neither spoke about but both could feel. Lila hummed when she worked, soft little songs that sounded older than the wind. Sometimes she smiled at things before they happened, like she knew the world's rhythm better than most. One morning, when Elias saddled his horse, she handed him his gloves before he reached for them. He frowned, asked how she knew. She said she heard him think of it. He didn't press her. Maybe he didn't want to know the truth. Weeks passed. The spring grass grew thick and green. Lila planted flowers near the porch and said she liked how they smelled when the wind turned. Elias built her a small garden fence, pretending it was for the rabbits, though he knew it was for her peace. In the evenings, they sat by the fire without speaking much. He read aloud sometimes, old Western tales or poems he barely remembered. She listened, her head tilted, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on her skirt. Then one afternoon, something happened that tore through the quiet like a shot. Elias had gone to mend the south fence, leaving her behind to tend the kitchen. When he came back, the door was wide open, and there were footprints in the mud, 2 sets, one small, one heavy. His chest went tight. He followed them behind the barn, where he found Lila standing still, facing a man who reeked of whiskey. It was her father. The drunk's eyes burned red, and his hands shook around a knife. He shouted about how she belonged to him, how he'd come to take her back now that he'd lost the money gambling. Elias moved fast, stepping between them, his voice low and steady like a storm about to break. He told the man to leave. The drunk lunged instead. The blade caught Elias's arm, tearing flesh. Lila screamed his name, not just a cry, but sharp and knowing, aimed exactly at him. She moved before he could stop her, reaching down for a rock, throwing it straight at the man's hand. It struck true. The knife fell, clattering into the dirt. Elias caught the man by the collar and threw him back, his voice cold as iron. He told him to leave before the law found him dead on someone else's land. The man stumbled away, cursing, vanishing into the trees. Elias turned to Lila, his arm bleeding. She was crying, her pale eyes shining in the fading light. She said she saw him fall. The words stuck in the air, heavy, impossible to ignore. He didn't question her anymore. He just held her close while the wind carried the last echo of thunder away. That night, she bandaged his arm carefully, her hands steady though her eyes trembled. He watched her, the way she tied the knot, the way she looked right where the wound was. He asked her softly what she really could see. She didn't answer. She just said that sometimes, when the light was right, she could see shadows of the world, faces, movements, feelings more than shapes. Elias didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out into the dark, wondering what kind of sight lets a blind girl see what others miss. He didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of something deeper, something that would make him question whether blindness was a curse or a gift from God himself. The days stretched softly into one another, painted in golden light and quiet routine. Lila had found her rhythm at the ranch, moving through the rooms like a ghost of calmness, her hands always in motion, her head tilted slightly toward sounds she pretended not to hear. Elias watched her from a distance most days, careful not to intrude, yet unable to stop his eyes from following her as she hung clothes on the line or brushed the dust off the porch railings. Something about her steadiness made the air feel less lonely, like the house itself had begun to breathe again. One evening, he returned from a long day in the fields, his shoulders aching, dust clinging to his skin like another layer of sorrow. As he came up the path, he stopped short. Lila was sitting on the porch steps, a sketchbook open in her lap. The sky behind her was lavender, the last edge of daylight bleeding away, and in that soft half-light, she looked almost unearthly. Her fingers moved slowly, tracing something across the page with a charcoal stick. Elias felt his chest tighten. She shouldn't have been able to draw. Her blindness made that impossible, or so he thought. He stepped closer, his boots crunching the dirt. Lila flinched slightly, closing the book and folding her hands over it, her face still and unreadable. He didn't ask. He just nodded and said quietly that supper was ready. But all night, his mind returned to that image, her hand moving confidently across the page, lines and shapes forming beneath her fingertips. In the days that followed, he found small drawings tucked away in odd places. On the windowsill in the barn, a scrap of paper held the outline of a horse's head. By the kitchen sink, another sketch, the curve of a cowboy hat, the shape of a porch, a lone figure staring at the horizon. Elias studied them in silence, his heart torn between confusion and awe. These weren't random marks. They were deliberate, detailed, alive. He started testing small things. He'd move an object, a bucket, a chair, just slightly out of place, and somehow, she never bumped into it. Once, he caught her eyes following him for a brief moment before she quickly turned away, pretending she hadn't. A quiet truth began pressing against him, fragile and dangerous. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, black clouds tumbling over the hills like a herd of wild cattle. Rain began to fall in thick, cold sheets. Elias ran to bring the horses in, shouting over the wind, his hat soaked through. When he finally reached the barn, lightning split the sky, lighting up the world for a brief, violent second, and in that flash, he saw her. Lila stood in the doorway of the barn, her hair drenched, her face turned toward him. Her eyes were open wide, alert, alive. For that instant, she wasn't blind. She looked at him, truly looked, her gaze locking with his in a way that made his heart stop. He froze in place, unsure if it was the storm playing tricks on him. Then thunder cracked, and she flinched, backing into the shadows. When he finally reached her, she was trembling. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, his voice soft, careful not to scare her. He said nothing about what he'd seen. Not yet. That night, the storm raged outside, and inside the cabin, something heavier stirred, the quiet tension of unspoken truth. Lila sat by the fire, her hands folded, her face turned toward the crackling light. Elias sat across from her, staring into the flames, trying to find the right words. But they wouldn't come. He didn't want to accuse her. He wanted to understand. Finally, he broke the silence. He said softly that he'd found her drawings, that they were beautiful. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then, after a long pause, she whispered that she only drew what she remembered. He asked her what that meant, his voice low, gentle. She said she remembered faces, shadows, places she once saw. And then, after a long, aching silence, she admitted something that made him sit perfectly still. She said sometimes she still could, not everything, not clearly, but flashes, light, outlines. The doctor back home had called it a miracle once, but her father never believed her. He told her to stop lying, and every time she spoke of it, he'd strike her. So she stopped speaking altogether. Elias's hands tightened into fists. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the scars of silence written all over her life. He told her softly that no one would ever hurt her here. The storm outside howled, but inside, a fragile peace settled between them. From that night on, something shifted. Lila no longer hid as much. She began humming when she worked, soft melodies that made the walls feel warmer. She'd talk about small things, the sound of rain, the smell of horses, the way the light changed before sunset. And though Elias tried to keep his distance, his heart had already crossed that line. One morning, he found her standing by the corral, watching the horses through the fence. He knew she could see faintly now, the way her eyes followed the movement proved it. She turned to him with a shy smile, one that melted the last walls he'd built around himself. In that quiet moment, with the wind stirring dust and sunlight breaking through the clouds, Elias realized the truth he'd been afraid to name. This girl, this woman who'd walked into his lonely life from the edge of ruin, had brought something back to him that he thought was gone forever. Hope. But as peace settled over the ranch, the past wasn't done with them. Somewhere beyond those golden hills, shadows still lingered, and one of them carried the name of a man who'd once called Lila his daughter. The storm might have passed, but a reckoning was coming. And Elias knew deep down, when it arrived, he would stand between it and her no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and life at the ranch began to bloom with a kind of gentle rhythm neither Elias nor Lila had known in years. The mornings smelled of hay and coffee, the afternoons were filled with the hum of cicadas and the soft shuffle of hooves, and by sunset, they would find themselves side by side on the porch, saying nothing, yet feeling everything. Lila had grown comfortable enough to let her laughter slip through now and then. It was quiet, uncertain at first, like a melody testing the air after years of silence. Elias would catch himself smiling at the sound, a small piece of his own loneliness dissolving with each passing day. He had stopped trying to understand how she could see, or how much she could see, and started simply being grateful that she was there. Her presence softened the edges of his rough world, like rain falling on dust. But peace, Elias knew, never lasted long out west. It was always followed by the wind, bringing word, trouble, or both. It was late one evening when the wind carried a stranger to his door. The man was tall and mean-eyed, the kind of drifter whose boots had seen too many taverns and too few churches. He introduced himself with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, said he was just passing through, looking for work. Elias's instincts bristled, but hospitality was law out here, and he let the man stay the night in the bunkhouse. Lila stayed inside, uneasy. When Elias checked on her later, she whispered that the man's voice reminded her of someone she used to know. Her hands trembled as she said it, her face pale in the lamplight. Elias told her not to worry, that no one could harm her here. But deep inside, he already feared the truth she couldn't bring herself to say. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The stranger's horse was tethered outside, restless. Around midnight, he heard the creak of the front gate and the soft crunch of footsteps heading toward the barn. He grabbed his lantern and rifle, stepping out into the cold. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of rain and something fouler whiskey. When he reached the barn, he saw the stranger standing by the stalls, talking to someone in the shadows. The flicker of light revealed Lila, standing stiffly, her hands clutching her shawl. The man's grin widened when he saw Elias. He said he'd just come to say hello to the girl, that he used to know her father. The air between them thickened. Elias told him to step away. The man laughed and said the rancher had no right to tell him what to do. The girl had been bought, after all. His words were slow and deliberate, meant to cut. Lila's breath hitched. Elias felt the old fury rise, the one he'd buried years ago with every friend and brother he'd lost. He told the man to leave before dawn. The drifter sneered, spat on the ground, and sauntered off into the dark. Lila turned away, shaking, whispering apologies through broken breaths. Elias wanted to tell her she had nothing to be sorry for, but the words wouldn't come. He simply placed his coat around her shoulders and stood beside her until her trembling eased. By morning, the stranger was gone, but not before leaving something behind. On the porch railing, a half-empty flask and a note scrawled in filthy handwriting. A man's got to know who he's living with. Elias didn't show her the note. He burned it in the stove. But he knew the past had found them again. Days passed, quiet but heavy. Lila sensed the change in his silence, his cautious glances toward the road, the way his hand lingered near the rifle more than before. She asked if he was angry. He said no, just be careful. She nodded, though her eyes said she didn't believe him. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Elias found her by the fence, sketching. He stood behind her quietly, watching the charcoal glide across the paper. She was drawing a face, the lines soft, familiar. When she was done, she handed it to him, saying she drew it from memory, from light. It was him. The set of his jaw, the lines near his eyes, even the curve of his hat captured perfectly by someone who was supposed to see nothing. Elias felt something deep inside him loosen, then ache. She saw him, not just with her eyes, but with something purer, something that went beyond sight. She saw the man, and he tried to hide beneath years of regret and loneliness. For the first time in a long while, Elias took her hand. He didn't speak, didn't need to. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from understanding without words. That night, as the stars came out, Lila told him she remembered what the stranger had said. He was right, her father had sold her for whiskey. But what he didn't know is that she had run before the deal was ever finished. The man who bought her never came for her, and she wandered until her feet brought her to Elias's porch. Elias listened in silence, his jaw tight. Then she said something that nearly broke him. She said she didn't believe God had forgotten her after all. Because if he had, she never would have ended up here. Elias turned toward her, his voice rough with emotion, and told her maybe God hadn't forgotten him either. In the distance, thunder rolled softly, not the kind that promised storms, but the kind that carried rain meant to heal. For the first time since she'd arrived, Elias felt something close to peace. But as dawn approached and the wind changed again, he had a sense that peace wouldn't last long. Somewhere out there, the past was still riding toward them, and this time it wouldn't just knock on the door. It would demand to be answered. The dawn came with a pale sky and a silence too sharp to be comforting. Elias woke before the roosters did, his instincts already uneasy. The world outside the window looked washed clean after a light rain, but something in the air carried the faint hum of trouble. The kind a man could feel in his bones before he ever saw it coming. He moved through the house quietly, not wanting to wake Lila. The coffee pot hissed, the wood stove crackled to life, and for a moment, everything looked as it should. But as he stepped out onto the porch, his eyes fell on the gate, hanging open, the latch snapped clean. His stomach turned to stone. Out in the road, Two sets of hoof prints cut deep into the mud, heading toward the river bend. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hat, his coat, and his rifle, and mounted his horse in one practiced motion. The morning wind bit cold against his face as he followed the trail. It was easy enough to read: one heavy horse, one lighter, both fresh. Whoever came in the night hadn't gone far. When he reached the ridge, he saw them, the stranger from before and Lila, sitting stiff in front of him on the saddle. Her hair was loose, her hands bound with rope. The man was talking, his voice carrying in the wind, ugly and slurred with drink. Elias's hands tightened on the reins. He rode closer, his boots digging into the sides of his horse, the world narrowing into a single point: get her back. The man turned, spotted him, and grinned, that same mocking grin that had haunted Elias for days. He shouted that the girl belonged to him now, said he'd paid her father fair and square, and he was just collecting what was his. Elias called back to say that she wasn't properly, that no man could own another soul, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let him try. The drifter laughed and reached for his gun. The sound echoed like thunder, breaking the quiet morning apart. Elias didn't think he moved. One sharp crack of his rifle split the air, and the man's shot went wide, striking nothing but dust. His horse reared, Lila screamed, and both of them tumbled hard into the dirt. By the time Elias reached them, the drifter was on his knees, clutching his shoulder, cursing through the pain. Lila had rolled free, shaking but alive. Elias dismounted and leveled his rifle, his voice low, deadly calm. He told the man to take his horse and leave, and if he ever came within sight of this land again, he wouldn't walk away a second time. The drifter spat something cruel, but the look in Elias's eyes made him think better of it. He mounted his horse one-handed and rode off, his curses fading into the wind. Elias knelt beside Lila, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. She was crying, not from pain but from fear, and something deeper, a fear of losing the one safe place she'd ever known. He untied her wrists gently, murmuring that it was over now. She looked up at him through tears, eyes wide and glistening. For the first time, she didn't hide it. She looked straight at him, really saw him, and this time, there was no mistaking it. The light in her eyes was real. Elias froze. He didn't say a word. He just brushed the dirt from her face and helped her stand. They rode home together in silence, the wind soft, the sky golden with morning. Back at the ranch, he poured her some water, set the cup down, and finally spoke. He said he knew now that she could see. She didn't deny it. She simply nodded, her voice trembling as she said she'd been afraid to tell him. Afraid he'd send her away once he knew she wasn't what she seemed. Elias shook his head slowly, the weight of her words sinking deep. He told her she could have come to him, that she never had to hide. She smiled faintly, saying she didn't want to lose the one person who'd ever treated her like she mattered, blind or not. That broke him in the quietest way possible. Days passed after that, each one softer than the last. The ranch returned to its rhythm, but everything had changed. Lila no longer pretended. She moved with confidence now, her steps sure, her laughter filling the house like sunlight spilling through old windows. One afternoon, Elias found her painting again in the barn, the light catching her hair just so. He stood in the doorway, watching her work. On the canvas was his face again, but this time, not the tired, lonely man she'd once drawn. This version looked alive. His eyes were warm, his expression peaceful. He didn't need to ask what she saw. He already knew. That evening, they sat together on the porch as the sky turned gold and red, the air alive with crickets and wind. Lila leaned her head against his shoulder, and for once, the ranch didn't feel empty. Elias had spent years believing the West took more than it ever gave. But now he knew better. It didn't take, it tested. It stripped a man down to his bones, leaving only what was real. And, if you were lucky, if you still had faith when the dust settled, it gave you something back worth keeping. Lila had found her freedom in the most unlikely of places, in the arms of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be seen. And Elias had found salvation not in the land, not in the work, but in the quiet grace of a woman who taught him that some people see clearer with their hearts than others ever will with their eyes. As the last light faded, Elias took her hand, rough against soft, and looked out across the horizon, that endless western sky that had witnessed every heartbreak and every beginning. The world was still wild, still cruel in places, but right here, in this quiet corner of it, two broken souls had found something stronger than pain, older than sorrow. They'd found each other. And sometimes, out here in the dust and silence, that was all the miracle a man ever needed.